Welcome to this explainer. If you've been glancing at the tech headlines lately, it really looks like European AI is just getting completely crushed by American giants. But honestly, beneath the surface, there's a totally different strategic game being played. Today, we're decoding exactly how that hidden game works and why it might literally upend all our assumptions about the future of artificial intelligence. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for decoding this massive market shift. First, the frontier model myth. Second, the regulated market bet. Third, 3 champions and their 3 strategies. Fourth, 3 ways the bet fails. And finally, the 89-day countdown. All right, starting off with Section 1, the frontier model myth. Let's deconstruct the mainstream narrative. And this brilliantly illustrates the core issue right off the bat. On the left, you've got OpenAI's massive $800 billion valuation. And on the right, Europe's leading contender, Mistral, sitting with a total war chest of about 2.8 billion euros. I mean, the compute and capital asymmetry here, it's not subtle, it's totally structural. If the game is simply who has the most money to train the absolute biggest model, well, the game's already over. But that assumption is actually deeply flawed because it completely misunderstands the battlefield. See, the American perspective basically assumes a single winner-takes-all global market. But the European thesis? They're betting on a completely different reality. And this matters deeply if you're investing in or building tech right now. They see the future as a highly regulated, fragmented landscape, essentially a protected submarket. In this European submarket, the winner isn't necessarily the absolute smartest model in the world. Nope. The winner is the model with adequate capability that can perfectly navigate intense legal compliance and data sovereignty rules. Which brings us to Section 2, the regulated market bet. Let's look at the 3 structural features. So, the first structural feature here is the Brussels effect. For non-EU vendors, compliance with the newly minted EU AI Act is absolutely mandatory if they want to sell into this massive market. And just look at these costs. For a small to medium enterprise, compliance audits alone run between 160,000 and 330,000 euros. That is the heavy dose of European bureaucracy, right? And if you mess up, the penalties are literally crippling. We're talking up to 35 million euros or 7% of your global annual revenue. This essentially forces major US providers to absorb incredibly heavy legal and engineering overhead just to play the game. It turns compliance from, an optional checkbox into a massive operational burden. Now, what's really interesting here is that there's a deliberate loophole written right into the law. Article 53, Paragraph 2 of the AI Act creates this massive procurement exemption for general-purpose AI models, provided they're released under free and open licenses. What this means is that open-weight models, like Mistral's Apache 2.0 licensed models, legally bypass a ton of regulatory friction. Meanwhile, models like Meta's Llama actually don't qualify for this exemption because their community license isn't deemed truly free and open by the EU AI office. So it's a very deliberate structural advantage for open-weight European tech. And the third feature is sovereign deployment. For defense, the public sector, and critical infrastructure, running AI air-gapped or entirely on-premise isn't just a neat little feature. It's a mandatory architectural choice. European vendors built their technology to be sovereign and on-premise from day one. In stark contrast, the massive US hyperscalers are kind of scrambling right now to awkwardly retrofit their cloud architectures to mimic those sovereign environments. By designing for these strict constraints right out of the gate, European companies have built themselves a huge head start. Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds into real-world tactics. 3 champions, 3 strategies. Profiling the vanguard. Take a look at this executive summary. Notice how the vanguard of European AI is attacking this market from 3 completely distinct angles. Mistral AI is taking the brute force scale approach, with 2.8 billion euros raised. Aleph Alpha, sitting at 500 million euros, has pivoted to specialized orchestration for heavily regulated industries. And then you have Black Forest Labs, with under 80 million euros, going deep into modality specialization, specifically image and video. Let's zoom in a bit on how each one is executing their specific bet. First up, we have Mistral. They are playing the scale game massively. Backed by ASML, which is basically Europe's most valuable tech asset, they aren't just building models. They're literally building the physical infrastructure. They're bringing a sovereign EU data center online by Q2 2026, and it's going to be packed with 13,800 next-generation NVIDIA GP300 GPUs. The strategy here is crystal clear. They want to own the massive inference economics for European enterprises that demand strict data residency and who refuse to run their data on US hyperscaler infrastructure. Next up is Aleph Alpha out of Germany, and they've made a pretty brilliant pivot. They realized they simply couldn't outspend OpenAI, so their strategic positioning became super clear. They want to be your sovereign infrastructure partner, not the European OpenAI. They built their Feria AI platform, and what's wild is their custom T-free architecture. It completely removes standard tokenization, which bypasses the processing overhead of breaking down words. That slashes compute costs by a staggering 70% for multilingual, specialized enterprise tasks. It's a huge deal. Finally, we have Black Forest Labs, and they prove that the European thesis generalizes far beyond just text models. With under 100 million euros in funding, they are dominating a very specific niche: high-end, open-weight Flunks image and video generation models. Think about European media and advertising enterprises. They are strictly bound by GDPR and super complex creator rights issues. Using US-hosted generalist models is basically a legal minefield for them. Black Forest Labs solves this beautifully by offering top-tier capability perfectly paired with local compliance. All right, now for Section 4, 3 ways the bet fails. Let's impartially assess the strategic risks here. So, the crucial point we have to acknowledge is that while this strategy is internally coherent, it's definitely not guaranteed. There are 3 existential threats that could unravel this whole thing. First, the Brussels effect could dilute. If the regulatory burden is just too high, mid-tier non-EU vendors might simply exit the market entirely, which thins out the competitive advantage. Second, US hyperscalers like Microsoft and Google might actually successfully retrofit their sovereign clouds faster than expected, say closing that architectural gap in the next 12 to 18 months. And third, perhaps the biggest danger, the US frontier capability gap could widen so fast that adequate European models simply aren't good enough anymore. That would force EU enterprises to just swallow the regulatory friction to get access to superior US intelligence. This brings us to Section 5, the 89-day countdown. The August 2nd, 2026 enforcement. For this European bet to actually succeed, 3 sequential milestones absolutely must happen over these next 89 days before the high-risk system requirements go live. Step 1, the EU AI office has to prove they have actual teeth and real enforcement capacity across all member states. Step 2, symbolically, the very first major non-compliance penalties need to land squarely on non-EU vendors to crystallize the danger of ignoring the law. And step 3, EU vendors like Mistral and Aleph Alpha have to prove they are fully ready to absorb the massive wave of enterprise procurement that's going to instantly shift away from non-compliant systems. So, what does this all mean? Well, the American tech industry built its entire valuation model on a single, winner-takes-all global market. But will that assumption actually survive contact with August 2nd, 2026? The AI landscape is fragmenting, and Europe has quietly architected a home field advantage that could potentially capture billions. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Definitely keep your eyes on the next 89 days because the global AI board might just be about to flip.